This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we're being recorded at this point. So just, can you not hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you.
So just as a reminder, planning commissioners should keep your video on if possible. Everyone should stay muted if possible, if that works. And non-commissioners should keep your video off unless you're trying to get my attention to ask questions or something. So any changes to the agenda for anyone? Monica? Oh, okay, good. Then open to the public for items not related to the agenda. So if anyone had anything not related to the agenda, you could put something in the chat, or you can turn your video and audio back on and call for our attention. Anyone?
I have a question for the committee.
Yes.
And please forgive my ignorance because I don't know if this is the appropriate forum or not, but my name is Tyler Barnes. I live at Wildflower Drive in South Burlington. And my question pertains to the proposed, for lack of a, again, forgive my ignorance, protection areas that were discussed earlier this month that Monica, that you worked on them. First off, great job. It's a very impressive body of work. And I think it's something we can all be proud of. So my question pertains to how these proposals, or how this proposal could affect development and planning for housing, ongoing housing in not just the Southeast Quadrant, but in South Burlington as a whole. My concern is that this could potentially place additional pressure on the city and on developers to try and further optimize levels of density on areas that are okay for development, or that have been sanctioned, if you will, for development. That coupled with the fact that there's increased awareness for the need for affordable or lower income housing, which presents margin challenges for developers. I guess what I'm saying is it feels like my concern is that it could further compress the amount of development on the available land that we have. And I'm in particular, I'm concerned with our neighborhood. We've always known that there will be development at the end of Wildflower Drive, and we support it, but we want to make sure that it's consistent with the character of our neighborhood. What has this been accounted for in the work, Monica, that your commission has done? And is this anything that the Planning Commission will consider as they examine these proposals? And I guess what assurances can we have that this won't continue to be an issue?
Those are some good comments and a few great questions. So we are evaluating some habitat conservation areas, or habitat blocks that would have limited development as a new natural resource that would be protected. I think that that's what you're talking about. And along with that, we're also looking at some other changes to land development regulations to look at planned unit developments, which is what we're talking about later on the agenda tonight. But I think, your concerns are something we're thinking a lot about, and how any change affects existing neighborhoods is something we think really seriously about, before we make any changes. So, thanks for kind of re-bringing those things to our attention, because I think we'll continue to think about them. Making sure we're not impacting existing neighborhoods is always high on our list of criteria. Monica?
Can I just clarify? So Tyler was just on the Community Watch group asking some questions on Facebook, and I think that's where what he may have been referring to. But I was going to mention, in connection with what he was saying, that I really do think that if there's a way, Paul, that maybe you could, I don't know how to summarize all together everything that we're doing, but in order to find a way to bring the community maybe up to speed as we're approaching the city council meetings and just everything else. I don't know if there's a way you can consider summarizing all of the pieces together in some fashion. I know the other paper has kind of changed ownership, but maybe they would accept a column. There's the new South Burlington City newsletter. Maybe there's a place there, but it does, I think Tyler's question comes in. He's obviously paying attention on the peripheral to what's happening. It's just there's so much that we are starting to hear questions, and something from you might be very helpful to prepare people for kind of preparing everyone for the public hearings that will be coming up. So just a thought.
I think that's a great recommendation, Monica. Thank you. We'll definitely follow up with that. And just one quick thing to add to what to Tyler's question, that one of the criteria that the commission started to look at very briefly a month or so ago was how in future planned unit developments the transition from existing neighborhoods to new areas will take place and be a smooth transition. I know that was one of the commission's goals from the very beginning of this project, was to make sure that however future development is shaped, that it's thoughtful as to how it relates to what's next to it.
Okay. And then Ariel Jensen Vargas, did you have a question for us? Okay, if you could turn your video off until you're trying to get our attention, that's just helpful for me to be able to really see who's asking questions. Thank you. Any announcements from any commissioners? Monica?
So the one was the request of Paul because of the kind of community questions that are coming up, which I think is great. So people are definitely aware and talking. I also wanted to say that on, I think it was the 17th of October, I was very impressed with the girls high school soccer team, who in conjunction with the Burlington soccer team held, and in collaboration with the UVM Student Athletes of Color Affinity Group, invited the community to listen to other community members share their experiences and perspectives of being people of color in Vermont. It was an amazing experience, and I hope that there's more of this. But something stood out to me, and I wish that I knew the gentleman that said this, and I'd still like to research it. But he shared a statistic, which is that within Vermont, generally, roughly 70% of white 70% of white Vermonters own their homes, while 4% of people of color in Vermont own their homes. I'd like to learn more about what we can do as a community to move things in a better direction. So I just wanted to bring that in. As I learn more, I'll share it. And finally, I wanted to thank Paul, because I sent him a god-awful list of my comments from this huge package that we have, and I did not expect him to respond, but he did, like, to every one of my comments. So thank you in advance, Paul, or thank you for doing all that. You're so busy. You came back from a week away to my barrage, and I really appreciate your time on that. So thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, Paul, did you have any other staff items for us?
No, I was away last week, so I came back and everything's still standing that I saw.
Yes, and you gave us lots of homework. So I think with that, we can jump right into our work session on the land development regulation amendments. We had quite the detailed kind of bullet list of items and specific questions in the memo, as well as the full draft for the subdivision and master plan standards. That was a lot of work, and we've been looking forward to it for a while. So thanks for getting it over. What do you think would be the most helpful way to go through this, Paul? Just kind of through the list of...
Yes, just one second. I was, yeah, I guess we flagged some key questions in the staff memo for you. I also tried in the draft for the subdivisions in the master plan to have comments throughout the margins. They don't necessarily match up every single one of them because I put the comments in the margins really to flag issues that you may wish to discuss, but sort of brought the biggest ones right to the staff memo. So I'm happy to start with the staff memo, or if you would like to go through it, however you'd like to go through. I know this is your first time seeing the whole package together.
Yeah, I guess as a first thing, does anyone have any remaining questions about the differences between subdivision, planned unit development, master plan, and site plan? You know, Paul had that great table in there, and I know it's been something that many people, citizens, and sometimes us kind of use some of those words interchangeably, but they are different. So I like the way you kind of laid that out for us there. Okay, Monica, did you?
Just the one, I guess the one, like when the subdivision package here is so detailed that, you know, for example, if we all agree to the Energy Committee's recommendation of the direction of the streets for best solar, if that's done in the subdivision, would that kind of detail naturally be carried over to the PUD?
Generally speaking, yes. The subdivisions are the foundations for the PUD, for the planned unit developments as well. The planned unit developments are intended to give a little bit of flexibility to the subdivision standards in order to achieve the very specific elements of the PUDs. And so that's kind of where those two come together. So we are expecting that there will be a little bit more flexibility in some of the areas, especially around, you know, lot sizes and shapes and things like that. But the intent is that the subdivisions are the foundations. That's the default. Anything from that becomes a sort of a negotiated adjustment in order to achieve the greater whole of the PUDs. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's why we're starting with the subdivisions, because that becomes the framework for everything.
Thanks.
So I guess there's two options here. One, we go through the memo, or one, we kind of go down through the actual language. If anyone has Michael, are you?
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether that's what we're going to do, go through the memo, and then if there are further detailed clarifications required, go to the text. I had one question for Paul in that under 15A, the new language is in italics, and under 15B, I'm not sure that that's the case.
That is correct. And I apologize if I didn't make that clear. So in 15A, the language in italics represents either new language or a substantially different discussion from currently. 15B, which is the master plan, doesn't have that because largely it's a completely fresh rewrite. Our current master plan language is a very, very small chapter that really just lays out a very light framework.
Okay. So then are we going to go through Paul's memo item by item where we have questions, or where Paul wants us to give him our views?
Yeah, so the first couple, you know,
Can I just say,
yeah.
sorry, all of my notes are based on the draft. So Paul, you saw a lot of my notes. I don't know what it might be easier ultimately to make sure we have enough time on the actual draft as well. So just.
I mean, essentially everything is in the draft. The memo is like a bullet list of kind of layperson descriptions of what the draft has in it. So, I mean, we could go straight to the draft language with the comments, unless someone really wants to go through the memo specifically. Okay, so it seems like
Well, yeah, I made my comment. Maybe it can be quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So on 15A 11, I would like to see us exclude level 2 as well from a buildable area. In general, it's my view of keeping as much space open as possible for the health and well-being of the community as well as of the planet, which we are all worried about. So that was my my first comment on Paul's general standards 15A 11, that we should exclude hazards level 1 resources and level 2 resources as a stretch. And then on 15A 14, but that's the energy committee's recommendations, I guess. I would say yes to both of those. 15A 14, public and private streets should be built to public standards. Under all circumstances, not only when they're going to connect to another roadway, because I've had sort of personal experience of that, where our own association did not do that. They didn't build it to public standards, and while there is a fire and emergency vehicle access to our development, the roads are not built to a standard that which would connect to eventually to Dorset Street. The roads aren't built to the public standard, so should be built to public standards wherever, not only when they're going to be connecting to another roadway. It should always be built to public standards, public and private streets. On the ratio 15A 16, I would recommend we keep the SEQ standard of 1 to 2 and 1 to 2.5 and 1.
I'm sorry, I'm having a really hard time keeping up with where all your comments are, and I feel like in some of them we could have some really fruitful conversations. Would it be better to just go through each of the sections and then talk through?
I'm going down Paul's memo, which was the first thing in the.
I guess I agree with both of you. I think it makes sense to go through the memo, but you proposed a change to buildable area. Maybe it makes sense to get everybody's comments on buildable area before we'd move on. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
So Paul has up the draft language here. Michael is suggesting also including the level 2 resources, which is a pretty big change from what we've been talking about for a while now. So I guess I'm just wondering if other people feel like that's something they're interested in pursuing. We had not included them in the first place because it seemed like there might be less legal ground for us to kind of reduce property values from those, and that's why we talked about kind of letting a property owner like transfer the density from those areas to the other parts of the property. But I mean, it's up for discussion, so
yeah, they were my comments were intended for all of us to think about.
Yeah.
And just to be clear for everyone, the standards that exist in Article 12 will apply regardless. So let's say there's a intermittent stream and there's a 10-foot setback. That applies unless under Article 12 the DRB grants an exception. So even the level 2 resources do need to be adhered to It's just a question of whether they get to count towards whether they're considered part of the buildable area of a property.
And I thought we were going to count them as buildable area because when we wrote the level 2 stuff, we allow for some flexibility with the level 2 stuff. Whereas the level 1 stuff, we weren't allowing for any flexibility, and we were just going to say, you know, thou shalt not touch it. Whereas level 2, I think we allowed a little bit of flexibility, and that was why, one of the reasons why we chose to leave that as part of the buildable area calculation.
Well, but you're referring, Bernie, to encroachment. I think this is a basis for calculation of buildable area.
I know that.
I have a comment or question. So I actually would, I am all for protecting the resources, but when it comes to, and this actually goes back to something that Tyler Barnes brought up, when I'm looking at this in terms of the calculation of allowable number of units, and that is if we go to building type, it changes, but in terms of calculating density, I don't know that level 1 area can't, the density assigned to level 1 resources can't also remain. They can't be built on the level 1 resource, but I think the number of units that acreage encompasses should be able to be built elsewhere on the land. And that would then, yes, result in a more densely built buildable area. So if we're talking about number of units within the buildable, I think level 1 acreage should count. And I think level 2 personally can be built on, but it would have restrictions in terms of how the level 2s need to be protected while built on or built around. And that's what I thought Articles 10 and 12 will be protecting. So I guess I just need some clarity on what is our conversation right now about? Is it about the units, or is it about where on the lot building can occur?
It's about the units, like the calculation. And just, I believe that in the PUDs, the level 1s do count the way that you're suggesting, Monica. This was one of the differences between the PUD and the subdivision. You know, I think our original thought was that the subdivision maybe didn't have the tools associated with that would let us kind of transfer all that density effectively. So if someone wanted to do that, I think they would use the PUD tool.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And so with PUD, I'd say yes, and then yes. Then I would agree with buildable areas. It is written here for subdivisions that do not include PUDs, hazards and level 1s, knowing that level 2s would count in buildable.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it appropriate for the public to ask a question?
Sure.
Does that, in layman's terms, does that mean that the guidelines for PUDs will be more relaxed or more restrictive in terms of how they will calculate the buildable space?
They will be more restrictive in how the buildings and roads are laid out. And there's really specific guidelines on types of buildings and spacing and things like that. And therefore, because it's much more prescriptive, we have been talking about having, if someone has a forest habitat area or any of those other level 1 resources, they'd be able to transfer that development into the remaining buildable area. Because there's so many more guidelines associated. Ted, did you?
Yeah, I was wondering if it was where Tyler lives, there is going to be there is a proposed development, Brad Gardner's development. And I wonder if it would help Tyler to understand what exactly can be built there based on what we're talking about here. Are you able to do a quick read on that, Paul? Because I mean, I think that's probably what he's interested in at this point, and we can get granular and say, okay, here's an example. There's a development going to go on, and with this wording, this is what can happen.
Right. Well, so adjacent to where Tyler lives is a sort of a 6 or 7 acre parcel that has a wide area sort of right at the end of Wildflower Lane, and then it narrows up dramatically and comes back to Heinsberg Road. That would be an example of what will likely be an infill traditional neighborhood, which would mean that the building types that you talked about last month that would allow for single families, 2 families, maybe some small multiplexes that look like single family homes would be allowable. There would be a need to put in so it would become a planned unit development. It would likely need to have a small parklet in it unless they can identify that there's another one nearby, which I don't think there is. What would be a little bit hard for me to describe in this case is how exactly they would relate to the adjacent neighborhoods, because there's several different things going on next to it. So there's Tyler's neighborhood, there's the Knoll Circle neighborhood on the other side. And so it would need to, the likely scenario is that the building types and the which are dictated in part by the lot widths. If you remember that exercise that we went through last month of looking at narrower and wider lots, it would tend to move towards the wider ones in order to be complementary to what's adjacent to it. Tyler, I think, may have seen, I'm not sure if Tyler saw, but the DRB saw last year a proposed neighborhood in that area that was somewhat along the lines of what would be allowed. There might be a little bit more design requirement to sort of have a centralized area to that neighborhood, and maybe a little bit more creativity in how homes can be shaped, but it's probably not that far off from what he saw previously.
So there were, if I recall, there were over 26 units on 6 acres. There was 1 dead-end street included in that, 2 dead-end streets included in that, and in that there was only enough parking for 7 units. They had allowed for 6 parking spaces, which means that some of the parking would have to overflow onto the street. So if I understand you correctly, the new regulations as proposed, and the DRB at that time said, I believe I'm quoting Tim Barrett directly, he said, too dense. It's too much. If I'm hearing you correctly, that under the new guidelines, that would be allowed, but with some minor changes.
Tyler. So one of the key provisions of what's in tonight's language and would carry through into the planned unit developments is that dead-end streets become very, very, very discouraged. And so they would need to be laid out in a way that creates essentially a block or more than 1 block. The number of units becomes an output, so that's hard to predict as to how many homes. But the purpose of the subdivision standards and planned unit developments is to make for a functional neighborhood. And I would agree that there were some problems with the prior design. I was thinking more about the sort of central axis of it, not the dead end streets parts of it.
Okay, I apologize. I respect the process, and I feel like I'm hijacking the meeting, but I appreciate your time. Perhaps, Paul, it might be more appropriate for me to try and schedule some time to come down to City Hall and to have a conversation with you one-on-one or with someone else who's informed in the matter, so that I can get a better understanding of this particular development. But I just don't want to hijack your meeting. I really appreciate the time.
Certainly.
But okay, great.
And
Well, thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you, Tyler. And Sandy has a question about infill, and you have your hand up, so I guess you can just ask it directly.
Well, last I knew, you needed to have at least 4 acres to qualify for a PUD. Maybe that's changed. So I'm concerned, and it seems to me some of infill developments would be parcels fewer than 4 acres, and therefore they wouldn't have the availability of a PUD to have the higher density in the buildable in the area where they could build. So I mean, and this seems contrary to what I thought the Planning Commission wanted with regard to infill opportunities on smaller parcels.
So Sandy, the draft as currently written would be that a planned unit development or an infill version of it becomes required at 4 acres if we're talking about residential neighborhoods, and is optional at 2 acres. So that's where the threshold currently is drafted, and that's consistent with the current requirement for in the R4 districts. You need at least 2 acres in order to be a PUD, in order to do something creative enough with the property.
Well,
So
I
Paul,
understand that, but you still couldn't do Kirby cottages with 2 acres because it's about 1.26 acres.
but I'm sorry, there's so much information we're supposed to be reviewing and I'm all over the place, but I seem to remember that in the master plan document that we're also going to be talking tonight, it does refer to the elective review that can be for, elective review can be for basically 3 acres and below. So if are we talking about something now that's in the master plan section?
I think Sandy is speaking about the thresholds for planned unit developments.
Right, but we're not talking about planned unit. We're trying to talk about the subdivision piece, because the PUD language is not what we're talking about now. And a PUD can be 4 acres or less, but the master plan gives the permission for 3 acres or less, maybe.
The point I was making was that Monica wanted to not exclude level 1 resources because that means density is less, and then she was assured that that could be taken care of by using the PUD avenue where those areas could be included, or you would have the housing types. And my point is that maybe there are some places that don't want to go through the PUD, but also there are small parcels that might want to develop but don't even have the option of a PUD because they're smaller than 2 acres.
Okay.
So I'm saying the PUD is not necessarily the answer, and it especially would be a barrier or inaccessible to a small infill development. That's the point I'm trying to make.
See, I'm not, and I just want to say for the record, my R1 comment, Sandy, if that came from our earlier meeting today, that's not regarding anything that we're talking about here. I just wanted to make sure there's no confusion there.
Sandy is talking about what I just said to you, Monica, about the level resources.
Okay.
The level 1 resources, I'm only talking about something discussed this evening.
Okay. I thought you said R1. I'm so confused. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we've talked about buildable area. There were a few items in the staff notes before this one. I don't know, Paul, if you want to pull back up the staff notes and we can just look at the first couple and see if anyone had specific comments on those before we move on. Okay, so
why don't we just move on to the text of the text rather than stay with Paul's memo. It seems that's what everybody wants to do. I don't know. I know that that's what Monica's done. I've read it through, but I didn't make comments there. But if we want to go through Paul's, there's lots and lots of notes that he's got for the Planning Commission to respond to. So we can go through it line by line, or article by article, or paragraph by paragraph. Otherwise, we'll never get anything done.
Yes, we are trying. Okay, so how about these first few items here? Were there any comments on these from the commissioners?
On Paul's memo?
Are these the first few items?
Yes, the first few items on Paul's memo, these are the ones specific to the subdivision. Okay.
Yeah, there might be, something might come up when we get farther down, because
So maybe, Paul, you can scroll down because we talked about this next one about the buildable area. Then we get into the resource protection. There is one of the blue comments there. I don't know if people had thought about that one at all. I like how it was written, but Ted?
Do we have historic sites here?
There are a few places that are eligible. There's a few buildings that are eligible. There might be some stone walls in the city. There aren't that many, but I could imagine not that this one would come into play because it's in the Natural Resource Protection District, but the stone house at the corner of Van Sicklin Road might be one. There's at least one in the Chamberlain neighborhood. Again, I don't know if this would come up too much, but it was a recommendation from our consultant to, at a minimum, identify them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my comment to that was, hell yes. And if there are other things that a property may have that wouldn't necessarily qualify as something with any official definition, but if the property owner was willing to preserve something that, you know, whether it's a scenic view or just something on the land that is cherished by the community. I know it's private land, but if there's something special and they're willing to tag it and conserve it or protect it in some way, you know, could they receive some kind of incentive for doing so? A landscape offset or something. So I would take that idea and I would even further it to give people incentives to protect special elements, whether it's official or not.
Very good.
Commissioners would like, we can certainly work on that. We have one provision in our regulations now that could be probably a little bolstered, but that you can get credit on your landscaping budget for retaining trees. We could probably be a little bit more specific in there as to what that means, especially when they're important trees, or maybe there's ways to do the same thing with a stone wall if it exists, or who knows what.
Mm-hmm. A really good point about both of those, because they are really interesting and important landscape features.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so not hearing any objection to that. So I guess, Paul, if you could scroll down, we can look at the next few, see if anything jumped out. So this street network does come into the dead end streets that have been brought up a few times.
Right, so this is one that I did want to make sure gets flagged, and I think I wrote it in blue at the top of the next page. There is, we can talk about the Energy Committee recommendation in a second. I did want to just sort of flag that currently our regulations discourage dead-end streets generally, but they specifically put a length limit in the southeast quadrant. The draft language would require that, would bolster that language and essentially say that dead-end streets are other than very, very short ones, not the accepted anywhere in the city. where the DRB determines that a dead end street, that something needs to be a dead end street, it then sort of gives the DRB a set of criteria to decide if there should be a connection. Even if it can't be a street, can it be a rec path? Can it be a sidewalk? And then the last option is that there's no connection at all.
I sort of have mixed feelings about dead end streets because when I passed Wildflower Lane or Street, kids are obviously, for the time being, it's a dead end street, and kids are safely playing there. Chicken Cider Mill 2, at the very end, most easterly part of the development, there's tons of kids there because it's a circle at the end. So, I'm not sure what the big yank is to preclude a dead end street if it's appropriate. Again, I would encourage for sure a connection of a bike path, but to actually feel that a street has to then continue on somewhere every single place, I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I think part of the issue, Ted, is just with respect to public works and the fire department, the ability to plow the longer dead end streets, and with the fire department, if the dead end street gets to be too long and you have some kind of blockage at the beginning of that dead end street, then that inhibits the ability of the fire department or an ambulance to get down the street. So that's why I think they're discouraged, because you want to have looping roads so that they have more than one way to access in the event of an emergency.
Yeah,
and I guess I'd add to the public works part of that, Bernie, to say that a big part of it is the long-term cost effect, the ability for the city to maintain all of that. So it takes a lot more work to plow a dead end road, for instance, and all the utilities are singular and they have to loop back to the beginning, and it pushes over time all the traffic onto a handful of roads, which winds up being, what the circumstance would get on a place like Dorset Street or Spear Street becoming. That's sort of the big picture.
Ted, as a resident of Wildflower Drive, I can tell you that, and I speak for all of us in the neighborhood when I say this, we would much rather have, and I have 3 small young children myself, 3, 6, and 9. We would much rather have it loop around and connect with Heinsberg Road. And we feel like that would be safer. The number of times on a daily given basis that an individual comes onto Wildflower Drive expecting it to loop through, and then finding that it doesn't, and then becomes frustrated with that and turns around and speeds out of our neighborhood at speeds of upwards of 40, 50 miles an hour, it would shock you. It happens at least, now that I'm at home full time, I can tell you it happens at least 5 or 6 times a day. Thing one. Thing two, it is really cumbersome for, with the snowplow got stuck at the end of the street last year. The garbage truck routinely gets stuck at the end of the street. And while it's cute and it's funny for the kids, the recycling truck routinely throws off a lot of glass bottles. So there's lots of shards of glass at the end of the street. It's a nightmare. So we don't oppose the development at all, and we'd much rather, and again, we'd applaud seeing it loop through. I think it'd be a lot easier for everyone, and if nothing else, would give the kids more space. We just want to make sure it's done responsibly.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. One thing I would add to what Tyler had to say is that, to me, one of the critical components of this is the street types that you looked at, about a year ago, of making sure that new streets are appropriately scaled to their neighborhood. So something like the Rye neighborhood across the street from where Tyler lives has pretty narrow streets that discourage high-speed movement. So, hopefully, it's disheartening to hear that people, even when they're stuck turning around, are going that fast along a street that, as Tyler just described, and future street design should be a lot narrower than that to make sure that that's not the case.
So can we just go back to the first one on the orientation. So I don't have any problem conceptually with orienting streets for solar gain. My concern is with the language to the extent feasible, because different entities will have different interpretations as to what's feasible versus not feasible. And so I'm not sure if we better define that somewhere, or because if you have a large piece of land, the developer may want to have the streets run in a certain direction, or the city might, and there may be. I guess overall, I'll keep it short. I think extent feasible is kind of loose, and it's defined by whoever is interested in defining it, and it's going to vary. So that worries me.
Can I add on to
that?
Can I add on to that comment that if I agree with what Bernie is saying, and if it becomes problematic for a street design to face the directions that they want, Paul, one of my questions was, is there a way to connect with, add to this a request to have ensure X% of rooftops face an advantageous direction, and that would allow designs in housing to have like L-shaped roofs, or for developers to be mindful of the housing design, so that they can ensure, if they don't have a street that's positioned in the right way, that they can try to ensure the homes built on those streets can be designed to have X% of their roof in a solar friendly direction. So maybe is there a way to combine these two thoughts?
We can certainly take a look at that. I actually agree with all the comments here. We generally dislike the words "to the extent feasible," and I can take a second look at this with our consultant. I think that this was largely sort of drawn straight from the Energy Committee.
Conceptually, it's fine. It's just that extent feasible is pretty wishy-washy.
Right. Well, and maybe just taking those words out and saying consistent with the existing and planned pattern of development and local topography should be oriented. The should already gives the DRB flexibility right there.
Well, and maybe in addition to local topography, I would just say, we've defined a whole bunch of hazards and level 1 resources. So maybe to say, as it logically relates to topography, hazards and level 1 resources.
Yeah, and I probably would add in, realistically, I think that the thing that is the most significant obstacle is just what the layout of the parcel is to begin with.
Right. Because, for example, like you look at, if we're trying to save trees, for example, and even though the street might be oriented so that the roof faces east, if there's tall trees to the east, then that kind of defeats the purpose. So, there's other considerations, I guess.
Yeah, you might want to specifically call out the existing street network too, because we also say they're supposed to meet existing streets at 90 degrees. So maybe that's specifically listed.
Yeah, so maybe just a little more language. I agree with removing to the extent feasible, and maybe just some criteria that we're looking for to provide specific guidance to lead people in the right direction. So.
I'm hearing a lot of common comments throughout there. So if am I reading it correctly to work on that? Keep it, but work on it some more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yes, Monica had raised the question of housing roof orientation as well, which we tried to discuss under the PUDs, but for whatever reason, nobody seemed to like it. But I think it's as an alternative or in addition to street orientation, building orientation or roof structure orientation is very important for solar or renewable energy. And we should think very hard about that. Not here, but in the PUDs.
Okay, great.
I had a sidewalk question. Should I wait till we get down into the?
Well, we're right here in the streets. Is it related?
Yeah, it's in that same section. It's in section 15A 14C6, but it states that sidewalks should be required. And I don't know that I personally agree with that. It said Paul's clarified for me that sidewalks are required where there's more than 4 units per acre, but that's being picked up from, I believe, what was created in the form-based code area. And there are areas, if there are other areas where the people walk in the streets and the kids play in the streets, and as long as the neighborhood is safe enough for that, you have more green space by not requiring sidewalks. So I just don't know that extending a city center sidewalk requirement citywide is a good idea.
So just to be clear on that, Monica, what I meant to say there was in city center we have the street types, and in city center basically you need to put sidewalks on both sides of the street.
Okay,
The
and that makes sense.
Right. Currently in the southeast quadrant we require sidewalks on one side of the street for most types of neighborhoods. The recommendation from our consultant was that anywhere where there's more than 4 housing units per acre, that there be a requirement for sidewalks on both sides. What we gave you was less than that, to say that to bring it back to the street types, and basically to say on neighborhood streets it needs to be one side minimum. We've found, frankly, that it's a little overbuilt in some areas where it's 2 sides of the street to have sidewalks, and you're right, it does take up a lot of infrastructure. At the same time, there is a complete streets mandate on all municipalities in Vermont to accommodate the needs of all users. And so I think it would be challenging to allow streets that didn't have any kind of pedestrian oriented focus. What we have done as a trial in one neighborhood, the new O'Brien neighborhood, and which we have proposed to put into the optional street types, is a shared street where the width of the street is wide enough to accommodate a fire truck, meaning 20 feet, but that a portion of that is a different texture to signal to everybody that that's supposed to be for pedestrians. That would be on a very slow speed street, because obviously we want to be careful that, kids walk into school or whatever it might be, that it's very clear to folks. So our recommendation would still be to keep at least one sidewalk or rec path.
Yeah, I think in terms of accessibility for all, that really having at least a sidewalk on one side, and I think in general the public supports having a sidewalk for kids to walk on. And just as a corollary or a question, Paul, I'm curious on the texturing, how you end up with a texture that defines a walkable area versus discouraging people from walking, in that, if it's too bumpy, kids aren't going to ride their bikes on it. And it becomes difficult to plow and maintain and all that. So
I have to remind myself exactly what we did on Ledge Knoll. I think that part of it became concrete, which was the sidewalk, and the rest was asphalt. So that's how we distinguished it. It wasn't about creating bumpiness. It was about a different material.
Got it.
I know that we sort of wrestled with the fact that in the winter, those two things expand and contract at different rates. So that's part of why it was a trial.
Yeah, and concrete doesn't do real well with salt either.
I just would say, and this might be more of a PUD conversation, but since we're talking about PUDs being able to go down to areas of as little as 4 acres, I would question whether on a 4-acre development, a sidewalk is necessary. And in fact, I think when you don't have sidewalks in the smaller areas like that, it actually overall reduces the traffic speed because everyone knows the kids are going to be in the street. So I don't want to take up too much time on it, but I would propose there being a little bit more flexibility on a neighborhood by neighborhood or development by development basis for sidewalks.
Yeah, and at this point, Monica, all of them are tied to the street types. So I think that, by consolidating all the different road standards into the street type menu, I think we'd need to create a street type that would have that cross section that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's
well, if there's a way to find out, I mean, if I'm the only one that thinks that in the city, then fine. But maybe we can seek some feedback there and just see if that is relevant to the people who would be developing. I don't know.
And it sounds like we have a trial version. So.
Yeah, and again, I would say in general that having accessibility for everybody is really important, and that then leads to at least one sidewalk.
I mean,
I would like to see the street types remain as they are and have at least one sidewalk. So that's.
I'm just thinking of cherished neighborhoods like Laurel Hill where there's no sidewalks at all and everybody's in the street, whether they're in a wheelchair or a stroller or rollerblades.
Well, and my subdivision doesn't have any sidewalks on the streets either, and there's people out there, riding bikes and walking dogs and playing basketball, but I can also say that in general that at least in my subdivision there, it can be a cut through sometimes, and the traffic gets going pretty fast, and I know that several neighbors have put up signs, kids, please slow down. And so, having a sidewalk, particularly for little kids, under the age of 5 or 6 or whatever, when they're on their little plastic bicycles, I think, parents would really appreciate having at least one sidewalk. And again, it stems back to, accessibility for all, for, handicapped and, sight impaired, that really, as Paul said, for, complete street standards, that's, I think where everybody is headed is to provide a safe form of walkability or movability for people that's separated from where the cars are driving.
I think you can also look at it in the connectivity of the other neighborhoods around it. I mean, there's a big part about that in the subdivision thing. If all the neighborhoods around have sidewalks, then it would make sense to continue that.
And I think the elderly probably, I don't know, but I'm not sure if they want to walk, shuffle along the street as opposed to a sidewalk. So I would agree that I think we do need a sidewalk on the side.
The sidewalks are very important. Sidewalks are certainly important, and I think we should stick with it throughout.
Okay, very good. So we had, Michael made some comments on this earlier about the public standards, whether or not roads are built to the public standards. And
yeah, I don't think I made myself very clear. What I was trying to say is that the city should not take over roads that are not built to public standards under any circumstances, even if they connect to another roadway.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I was public works director in Shelburne, there were a lot of subdivisions that built, to private standards, and then, the HOA ran out of money and wanted the city to take it over. And, in a lot of cases, they were told no, because it wasn't built to town standard. And then, you're stuck 10 years later with an HOA that can't afford to maintain their roads and in a couple cases, they actually went back and refinanced through the HOA to rebuild their road to city standards so that the city would take it over. But it becomes a big controversy, later on. So, I guess I'm an advocate for, build it to the city standard. And if you truly want it to be private, then there's got to be something that says, the city's just not taking these.
Yeah. So it seems like there's support for Paul's suggestion that the city council actually adopt a policy on this. So it's not just in the LDRs, but it's actually a stated city policy.
Yeah, it needs to be pretty firm because,
right.
My experience is it comes up and it comes up after, 10 or 15 years when the road starts to fall apart and the HOA doesn't have any money to plow it and fix it. And, then they come to the city and.
Yep. And Bernie, what you're describing, I'm reading a fair amount of literature all around the country where roads built in the 50s, 60s, 70s that are owned by homeowner associations, they're begging municipalities to take them over. This is happening everywhere, and we wholeheartedly agree. And the second thing that our staff recommendation here is that there are times when a road is built to public standards, but it will eventually connect. But in the meantime, it's only serving a neighborhood. And so staff's recommendation is that the council consider a policy whereby they don't take it over until it connects, because each street that we take over is a significant responsibility on all the taxpayers. And when it doesn't connect to something else, it's really not serving the community as a whole.
Mm.
Now, obviously, the property owners there are very interested in wherever this might be, are very interested in the city taking it over because it shares the cost, but that's the balancing act.
I'm seeing a lot
As long
of.
as it's, yeah, as long as it's built to city standards, it can connect. It can be taken over if it connects to a roadway later in life. But I know from our own experience here that Ridgewood has to put aside $300,000 or $400,000 every 15 years, which we do year by year, to maintain, excuse the word, shitty made roads here, cut corners, and the road bed is not good, so it cracks and it needs a lot of maintenance. It needs to be resurfaced every 10 or 15 years, and we account for it. So let's not take over anything that's not built to city standards under any circumstances.
Okay, so what's the head nodding here? Okay, do we want to scroll down, see if there's additional comments through the next section of bullets?
Michael corrected me. I wrote September 11th as being when that was discussed. Just for everybody's clarification, I meant to write September 9th.
Paul, I had, this is just a language thing. I had made the comment that with our new natural resource protection, and we're talking about the habitat crossings, connectivity might need to be specified. And I noticed that in this 15A14, you did talk about street connectivity versus when we're talking about like the natural corridors, having the resource connectivity as well. So maybe like street connectivity is the way to refer to it whenever it's talking about anything else. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yep.
And then habitat crossings or or natural corridors or something, so we're not duplicating a word that means something different, because I was getting confused a few times.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Paul,
Ted?
in our layout of the blocks, are we really talking about a grid system, or are we talking about developments that can have sort of meandering streets?
Largely, Ted, this would become, I hate to use the word grid because it makes me think of Manhattan, which is not what we're necessarily proposing here, but something that is more of a network like you might find in the Orchards neighborhood, where there are 4 sides to a block, or the 4th side might be a park, or it might be a natural area, but the idea here is to create actual blocks. Sometimes they might be a triangle, sometimes they might be a square or a rectangle, but the idea would be if you have enough space to do a block, then you should be making blocks. And further, wherever it can be done, the regulations encourage streets themselves to become the delineator between a park and a neighborhood, or between a natural resource and a neighborhood, which is it allows for those spaces to be more clearly separated than just being in the backyard of somebody. But it is, it's not the favorite thing for developers because they like to put homes on both sides of streets wherever they can.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask is that, I mentioned a bunch of times I've biked every neighborhood in the city numerous times, and Dorset Farms comes to mind. On the outside, it's a very long loop all the way around, single family, and then there's duplexes, and then it comes back to the where it originated. And then inside there are, I call it the grid, but the square, but it does create sort of a more attractive community than you look down, straight down, there's a tree right in front of every house, perfectly straight. And it just, I don't know, it loses creativity. Just a thought.
Yes, right. So the idea here would be, Ted, that there's a total perimeter of your block. I think it's 2,000 feet. And so you can sort of make it. You can be creative within that. That's the scale, which is when we went through that exercise last month of showing the various different neighborhoods. 2,000 feet for the outer perimeter of a block is a pretty standard number. How you get to it, whether you want to make it with S's or you want to make it with triangle or rectangle, or you want to have something creative in it, that's up to the developer to do.
Yeah, so it can have
Thank you. I was listening, by the way. I listened to the answer.
Wait, Paul, do you want to scroll down so we can see the block note you have there?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Just a second. Sorry, I had my screen on pause there.
Okay. Any other question on block or lots, I guess? Well,
I just had one. Paul, this was earlier too. When you're saying a minimum of the 10% buildable is reserved for the civic space, again, back to the concern Ted always brings up, reinforcing that 10% in that civic space cannot be in a wetland. It needs to be.
Yeah, so we'll double check that. The way it's written here is when it says 10% of the buildable area, that means that it can only be from the buildable area. But we will also double check and make sure, sort of to what Michael was raising earlier, that it's not a class, it's not a level 2 resource either. This is intended to be usable space for people who live in the neighborhood.
So that's, again, getting confused. I'm getting confused with where we started tonight, talking about our level 2s buildable. or not? And we said we were talking about buildable area as meaning units
Right.
that you can count.
Yep. What I'm saying here, Monica, is that we can double check and make sure that when you calculate your 10%, your 5,000 square feet, that it's not counting something that would otherwise not be able to be built on through Article 12.
Well, right, but also I'm saying where they choose to then place that 10% to ensure they're not placing it on top of a level 2, for example.
Right, we're saying the same thing.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
And it's a very good point.
So this is a little bit of a change. As I said, the southeast quadrant already requires this, though it's written a little bit differently. And the proposal is that the planned unit developments have it. This was a strong recommendation of the consultant that even in the circumstance of a standard subdivision, that this be an incorporated element. And it can be written in a couple different ways. The consultant first wrote it that it needed to be in each block. Staff felt like as a new provision that might be a little bit constricting on folks, and so we said 10% of the overall centrally located, essentially.
Okay, anything else on here, or the width to depth ratios, or anything?
Wait, I'm sorry. So, but what if you're doing a subdivision of a very small acreage, or is a civic space in a traditional subdivision, which is, I'm sorry, please remind me, are we talking about 10 acres here?
This is any subdivision.
Okay,
yeah.
So is a civic, in a traditional subdivision, is a civic space necessary if it's a very small space?
Like if you had 1 acre and you're making 2 half-acre lots, that kind of a thing, Monica?
Yeah, and up
yes.
to what point,
That's a great question, Monica, and it's actually a question that I flagged to our consultant just before sending this out, and we agree that there should be some kind of a minimum below which it doesn't need to happen.
Okay.
So I asked her to work on that.
Very good. Anything else here on the lots? Okay, then the renewable energy facilities.
I had a question on the language under 15A, 17A, that the applicant must demonstrate that. Must is not a strong word. I would say that the applicant shall demonstrate that a proposed subdivision and development will not exceed the existing planned capacity, and the applicant shall demonstrate.
Interestingly, Michael, this was a recommendation from legal folks to change the word shall to must, because must is considered stronger, apparently.
I've always been told by my lawyers, shall is the one, but okay.
Well,
yeah,
I'll double check, but the intent was to be more strong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that was the end of the bullet points in the staff memo for subdivisions. Does it make sense to see if anyone else has questions or comments on the subdivision language before we get into anything for master plans?
Can I just ask, wait, sorry, can we just back up for a second? There was just a conversation earlier in another Affordable Housing Committee meeting I was in, talking about something separate from what we're working on right now, but a parallel path that has been set up, if you will, of I believe it was the land trust making a recommendation that the city not add to its infrastructure in certain areas of the city. I want to make sure that what we've just talked about here, we did not just necessarily agree to not, the city can still add to its infrastructure. That's not, I'm sorry, I just missed something that was just said, and it sounded like we were agreeing that they must work with current infrastructure. We didn't just say that, did we?
I didn't.
Okay.
No, I think what it's saying is that Michael was referring to the section that you must demonstrate that you're not exceeding capacities, which is it's a general provision that's been in our existing rules that
Okay.
If let's say the city has no more wastewater available for whatever reason, then you can't get an approval until there's sufficient wastewater capacity to do it. Or if this is not likely to happen, but if for some reason somebody proposed a huge neighborhood that would require the schools to, build another building, then the subdivision would have to be paced in a manner that the schools can accommodate. The scale of development in Vermont doesn't typically lead these to be problematic issues, but they're in there as safety nets.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, there have been.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Monica. I'll go after you.
Just that there have been areas that have been built, and they, at the time of development, added on to the city's like sewer system, sewer structure to be able to offer city services. So I just want to make sure we're not saying that we're banning that ability. Okay. Right?
Yeah. And kind of where I think this language is headed and where I've seen it apply in real life is, for example, if the city has, say, a 6-inch water line that runs into a certain area, and you build a subdivision and the 6-inch water line doesn't have enough capacity to supply, the water and fire flow and all that, the developer might be required to, upsize, the existing water line to, a larger diameter in order to be able to provide the capacity that's needed for their subdivision. And they would have to do that typically on their own dime in order to get approval of subdivision.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that, because I was hearing it as, and they therefore don't have the permission to even do that work on their own dime. So as long as they have the right to do that work, to bring it up to speed.
Not only do they have the right, but the city would most likely require that they do that in order to be able to build the subdivision.
Okay.
Right. And for the most part, Monica, these are the subject of separate ordinances that require those things. So as Bernie said, you must have a flow of X amount of water supply or wastewater, and if you can't meet that flow, then you are responsible for bringing it up to speed. Something like fire protection the solution to it might be phasing. It might be that as the city, looks to, as we grow, we might have more firefighters. It might be that we can't take 400 homes in 1 year, but maybe it's 200 in year 1 and 200 in year 2 after it's been staffed up. Again, that's not typically an issue in South Burlington to be ramping up that quickly, but it is a safeguard to protect against it.
Paul, and you're.
Yep. On the issue of connectivity, are you taking on with this Swift Street connecting to Heinsberg Road and South Village connecting to Dorset Farms, some of the big connections?
So I think it would be, if there was a development anywhere in the city, those connections to existing nearby neighborhoods would have to be evaluated and made.
Yeah, I think I always appreciate how, Paul, you don't often have a lot of questions, but the ones that you pose are right at the heart of the issues. My recommendation specifically with Swift Street is that before you get to the very end of this process, that you have a discussion about what you want to do as a city with Swift Street specifically, because there are arguments for connectivity. There's also arguments for the natural resource that it crosses, and also the results of the recent Tilly Drive transportation study and what it said about what it does and doesn't do for transportation. So I would suggest that in that particular instance, because it's such a potentially significant or not roadway, that you have a specific policy discussion and decide what the city policy is, and not leave it just to the development that may or may not take place there in the future.
Well, and that then stems into our city map too. And what we include is that we want or don't want.
I think there were two other possible connections too between neighborhoods besides South Village and Swift Street too.
Right, connecting between Dorset Street and Heinsberg Road. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a toughie. I mean, you'll lose friends over that, you know.
I think there are two connections. One through from Cider Mill to Heinsberg Road.
One's been approved, and there's another that's planned.
Planned, yeah.
And
Paul,
I also go ahead, Mark. I just wanted to
ask Paul Connor, if does this part of the conversation in your mind have to be something that takes place during interim zoning before we finally recommend the Article 12 and the PUDs to the city council? Do you feel like it has to happen within that, or is it something that happens after that?
Let me think about that. I guess I would suggest that it be done in the not too distant future, because I know it's been a subject that the commission's really been interested in. It's come up at the council level a few times. I don't know that the timing is critical related to interim zoning, but at the same time, if and when folks on the Hill Farm specifically pursue some kind of development, then having some clear direction from the city and not having that be in front of the DRB as a open question, I think would be a good idea. Mm-hmm. I would say that the standards that you have in here and in Article 12, it's a bit of a borderline case, because the official map calls for the connection, but then there's natural resources coming through here. So I think that, having that policy discussion in the next 5 or 6 months and making a determination would be a good idea.
So my follow-up to that is just, at the time that we do that, can you please make it a very clear independent agenda item so that it's its own talking point for a while, so the community can be very well aware of that?
Yes, absolutely.
And keep in mind, connectivity could be vehicle, it could be bike path. So connecting comes in the different varieties. So.
Paul Engels, did you have more?
Yeah, Ted. The problem is that you'll have neighborhoods that are right next to each other, and kids, may play together in the same neighborhood, but it may be a 3 or 4 mile drive with a car to go pick up a kid for hockey practice, and they're next door neighbors. So a lot of the reason for connectivity is just to cut down on driving.
I've been there, had 3 girls who played hockey.
Yep.
Great point, Paul.
So at this point, we made it through the bullet points in the memo on the subdivision. Does anyone else have anything you'd like to talk about with the subdivision before we talk about master plans? Michael?
I still have something on 15A17, which was the renewable energy facility. We already talked about the language being physically feasible, reasonable, etc., as being inadequate. But I'd like to add also that at the end of that sentence, use of renewable energy resources shall include one or more of the following: shall or must include one or more of the following. Under G, 17A.
Yes, I don't think you've talked about this one as a commission, so please go ahead.
Yeah. No, I didn't earlier, but we did discuss the language in that first sentence.
Oh, right, yes. Yep.
But as being a bit wishy-washy and needing to be tightened up, but also at the end where it begins EG, it should read energy resources shall include or must include one or more of the following.
That seem like general agreement on that as well?
Let me ask, can I ask you a question about that? That whole concept? It's not that it's a bad concept, but what are the unintended consequences of that in terms of pricing for housing? How is that going to affect the pricing of housing? We already have an issue with housing that costs
About 1%, according to an expert who testified before the form-based code committee.
1% of the cost of the house or the cost of the house?
To make it solar, to have it solar ready roof or.
Yeah, so that was one of the more extreme options here. Some of these other ones look like they'd maybe be or potentially be a lower lift. You know.
Well, then choose one.
Yeah, and they would.
And Duncan, I wasn't concerned with cost so much as the life of my great grandchildren. You know, this is a climate change issue. We should do everything we can to get as much renewable as possible. And planning, that's what planning is about. It's not about deciding how many houses go where and how dense it is. It should be about the future of South Burlington and the health and welfare of those who live here in the next century.
We have
Yeah, and so I have just a little bit of a problem with the word shall because it may not be feasible to one of those 5. I'm wondering, and is there a 6, Paul, on the next page, or is this it? And where I'm headed with that,
I think that's it.
Okay, is that is adding a 6 that maybe has not sure the exact language, but essentially investment or participation in community solar that may be off-site. So, you know, maybe it's not feasible to have a shall in the specific subdivision that you're building, but if there's a lot somewhere else that you can contribute to community solar and you know, meet the objective of renewables as an additional option to shall in that specific development. My concern with shall is that you know, kind of to Duncan's comment on the unintended consequences, I'm just not sure conceptually whether, you know, in any particular plot of land you could meet one of these 5. And maybe you could, and if you could, that's fine. But I think adding a 6 that, you know, if you can't meet these 5, then participating in a community solar or something like that somewhere else to make sure that you get, you know, your renewable energy credit, because I think that's a good idea. So anyway.
Well, there's solar access easements, for example, which are which use surface, but not a big investment. But yeah, if there's another way to do it, but you know, climate mitigation is not free. It's always costs, but not doing it is much more expensive in the long term. So
yeah, and I'm not necessarily advocating for not doing it. I'm saying if you're going to add the word shall, maybe you should add, you know, something for an additional option for, you know, participation, you know, in off-site community solar or something that, you know, still meets the objective, but gives another option to do that. Because I'm just not sure, without thinking it through with every possible scenario, that for any specific block of developable land, whether you'd be able to meet all these 5 or any one of these 5, and having an off-site option, I think, accomplishes the goal of making sure that renewables are considered and provided, but it gives an option to do it not within that specific block of space.
Something like item 3.
Especially if you're going to use the word shall.
So I saw
Are you thinking of something like item 3?
Yeah. So I have actually a comment about the easements. I know that earlier in the language we remove utility easements from the buildable area, and I feel like this kind of an easement, because it's something we're asking for above and beyond, shouldn't be removed from the buildable area. This feels like it should be not count as one of those things that gets
Yeah, I
removed.
agree with that.
That makes sense to me.
Well,
Yeah.
and also,
okay.
I mean, a creative, and we don't know where things are going in the future, but I wonder if at some point an easement like that, or a lot where it's the community solar, couldn't be combined with civic space in a safe way. I mean, that it's possible that our solar technology will bring us to that point where we have a wildflower field and just even walking areas within a solar field. So creative minds might be able to combine their requirement of a civic or public area, perhaps with some of their solar for a community.
Yeah. Okay. So this seems good.
I did have one more, and it's Paul. I mentioned electrical, which
Like
in your
an
your electrical that you tied it to I tied it to the utilities and services, but my intention was more related to G and renewable, that it is much more encouraging to people to use electrical kitchen appliances rather than defaulting to gas if their home already has a level 2 in it, and a level 2 electric, and also if it already has electric or a level 2 for cars. So I was really connecting my request that we require that all new development include level 2s for kitchen and for garage as part of this.
Are you talking about the 220 amp outlet? Like
yeah, the level 2 the charger, yeah. And, you know, if you're starting from scratch, you just put it in at the at the time you're building and it's done, whether the people want to use it or not, but it's there.
So you don't necessarily mean the charger, you mean the outlet is capable of it?
That's right, that you have a level 2 capable in both your kitchen and in your garage. 2 separate lines that are both dedicated level 2 lines in your panel that you can then later add your charger to if you want to, and you can use for a stovetop if you want to.
Yeah, I wonder if that falls into the solar ready category.
Well, it's renewable energy.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it might fall more, if this is what you would like to do, it might fall more under the section where we talk about the stretch code in Article 3, because that's
okay.
more about buildings themselves, whereas this is about the subdivision.
Okay.
I'd want to think about that one a little bit. It's a really interesting idea. I want to make sure that it can be done under zoning and it's not considered a building code issue. And B, I guess I'd want to talk with our electrical inspector just to see, like, it doesn't sound like necessarily a big problem, but I'd like to sort of know the scale of what that represents.
That's fair. And I know that other communities are doing it. I was reading up on it, so if I find more examples, I'll send them to you.
That'd be great.
Yeah. The point is, it's easier to do it when you're just starting.
It can be a problem.
Okay, so
it can be a big problem.
Other commissioner subdivision questions or comments?
Can I just get, I didn't quite hear what Michael just said.
No, it was a personal anecdote that getting a level 2 charger can be a problem. It cost me $1,500 because my garage is 110 feet from my house, and I have to get the level 2 charge line from my house to the garage. So if it's done up front, as Monica says, it doesn't cost virtually anything.
So Jessica,
Are we done with the renewable energy paragraph G now?
I believe so. And we were talking about general other comments on the subdivision section.
are we going to, after this, go to the specifics down below in the language? I mean, it's already 8:39. So should I just ask my specific questions now?
Any specifics about, any specifics about the subdivision? I just didn't want to get into master plan until we've already gotten through. And we do, we'll be able to pick up tomorrow as well. So.
Well, so if I can ask, can I have a turn here? Okay, so it kind of came up in 15A11, and it probably comes up other places too, but there's definitely been questions about trying to figure out, and this gets into the PUD, so now I'm confused about why it relates to that. But Paul, it goes back to that question about the number of units, and by moving from old regs to new regs, are we increasing opportunity for units? Are we mathematically cutting number of units? So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to this 15A11 to see why. But Paul, that exchange we had?
Yeah. So the question I think that you're asking is how, and this is something I know Ted had raised previously, what's the effect of removing hazards and potentially level 1s from your subdivision / your density calculation, right? So today, if you're doing a straight subdivision, then you can divide up each lot has to stand on its own. It has to meet its minimum lot size, and therefore it needs to meet the density. There are times when parts of a wetland or something like that might be in a parcel. And so in a straight subdivision, the draft language might have some small reductions in what can take place. In a PUD, which is how most development occurs today, the density can be shifted around. It can be moved all to where it's physically capable of doing it within certain boundaries. And so, in the R4 district, it can't be more than 4 units in the building. You still have to meet setbacks, you still have to meet height standards, all these things, and of course it still has to be something marketable. And so while you can shift the density around today, in practical speaking, for the most part, developers don't go to the absolute theoretical maximum they can, because the resources and other restrictions just make it so that it's not really that feasible. Under the future planned unit developments, you've got conservation PUDs and you've got the TND, NCD types. In the conservation PUD, what you're saying thus far is that the level 1s can be transferred, and that's how that area can be moved into your development area. That's where you get your density from. In the TNDs and NCDs, what you would do is you would cut out your natural resources, the hazards and the level 1s, they come off the top. And then your density is calculated based on the building type. Your minimum becomes the old maximum. So there is a floor in a TND that guarantees that there's a certain amount that takes place, and then the ceiling becomes higher. Realistically, in most cases, that will mean an equivalent amount of housing, or more in some cases allowable. It will be in the more extreme circumstances where a property has, 16 acres of wetlands and 4 acres of developable area, where the theoretical might go down a little bit. But as a practical purpose, as a practical matter, it's not likely to actually go down very much because, you know, under the old rules, you could still only build in the 4 acres, even if you had a mathematical number that was higher. Does that help? I know that it's hard because I'm not giving you hard numbers here, but it's a little bit of apples and oranges, so it's hard to give it as hard numbers.
I guess it's just so that all the planning commissioners know the kind of concerns that we will hear are when we expand on Articles 10 and 12, are we therefore reducing overall unit availability or opportunity? And if the simplest answer, which isn't necessarily always the right answer, but if the simplest answer is if your natural resource protection is minimizing your buildable calculations in a subdivision, moving over to a PUD will generally bring your units back up, but with more restrictions, right?
I would say generally speaking, yes, and generally speaking, the regulations in a PUD in the future will allow for more housing than the current because you're using the building types. It will be more, but it may be required to meet more context sensitivity. So it may not feel like more. Somebody may choose to do fewer large homes, but they may choose to do more smaller homes. So it gives a little bit more flexibility in that way. The places where it might be a little bit less would be in areas that there's a lot of certain types of natural resources. And in those cases, you've got the conservation PUD to bring it pretty close to where it was previously.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in response to that, we do in the chat have a suggestion from Sandy to reduce the minimum parcel size for PUDs from 2 acres to 1 acre. And I know we're not talking about PUDs specifically tonight, but I think we should keep that in mind when we kind of review that language next. So. Any other commissioner language specific items on the subdivision? Because I would like to open it up to the public, but I don't want to cut anyone off if there's commissioners who have items. So. Okay, not hearing anyone jump to it. Did any public people have any comments on the subdivision language? I know Ariel, you had popped up there a little while ago. I don't know if you still had a question. You can go ahead, you can unmute.
Hi, I just want to say just a few points. One is that I actually did get stuck skiing in the South Burlington woods and ended up on Dorset coming out of Dorset Farm. And I live in South Burlington, in the South Village. And there was no way to get back because there were no sidewalks on Dorset. So because of the connectivity, I think it's going to make it a lot easier for anybody doing physical activity in these areas to get back home, say, for example, if they got lost, which is what I did. So the other thing is I'm from New York City, and my specialization is the gas lines for, and in this case in New York City, it really has something to do with the basement. When I'm hearing that the additions that are being allowed on houses, the gas lines are being run, I'm actually pretty concerned. In New York City, it's in response to a lot of federal regulations, which were in 2016, which were put into place because of explosions in Boston and in New York City, when people basically who are not licensed to touch gas lines did extensions from the main gas lines into other residences, and it's since been major crackdowns. And I'm sure that all the contractors are above board, and maybe Vermont is totally different, but I would basically say that if I'm not in the commission, but I would actually look more skeptically on any allowances for gas lines if electric is available.
Okay.
That's just my 2 cents.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Any other commissioner items on subdivision? Okay, I know we are getting late. Do we still have some capacity to start on the master plan line? Okay, I'm not hearing objections, so let's at least start to look through the staff bullets.
I still have.
Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question on the very, very beginning of this text. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me? Under the very beginning authority, under 3, which is modify or waive a requirement standard under this article, I think that that whole paragraph and all those ways in which the DRB can grant a waiver is a passport to getting somewhere where we don't want to go. I've been told quite clearly by a chairman of the DRB that when there's a conflict between the public interest and the interest of a developer before the DRB always finds for the developer. And I'm worried that where all these opportunities for waivers will result in many deviations from what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm really I have a problem with it. I find this quite problematic for me to accept that the DRB will have carte blanche to grant all these waivers or modifications, and I think it needs to be tightened up somehow. But the language is too loose, in my view. And
okay, Michael. One just thing I want to just be clear on, and perhaps there's a way that we can be more clear in the language here. Under number 3 here, in order for the DRB to grant such a waiver or modification, they would have to find all 4 of those criteria to be met. So it's not a series of options. It's a and. So it was intended to be a pretty tight box. I don't know if that changes any of your thinking on that, but it was intended to be pretty tight. But we're happy to take a further look at it. We wanted to give some ability for the DRB to not. Currently, what happens is that everything that can't meet a strict subdivision winds up being a PUD, which waters down PUDs dramatically. We don't want to be doing that in the future because PUDs are supposed to be something augmenting, not dropping. So this was really supposed to be for the very unusual circumstance. But Monica had a similar question, so maybe to me earlier. So maybe we need to take a second look and be very clear about that this is a high bar.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say that it's that because I also Michael didn't read it as all of them. I was reading it as each of these individuals. So it's probably just in the language of ensuring that it's all. Thanks.
Yeah, I think in general it's pretty good. That where I agree with Michael and Monica is where you go comma or other legal or development constraints, and that to me is where the wiggle room is.
Yeah, for example, let's take I own a hillside property with a slope of more than 20 degrees, and I want to terrace it and grow rice. I can comply. The DRB could grant me a waiver and comply with all these requirements.
Oh. Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, developers are budgeting as part of their projects, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars for attorneys to get waivers for them. So there's almost no way you could ever write this tight enough.
Yeah. So it seems like there's some concern about this section, Paul. And I guess I'm wondering what the best approach is. I know the DRB themselves have actually offered to give us advice and review if we ever need it. I'm almost wondering if maybe hearing from both the lawyer and maybe even the DRB, how they think this might be implemented could be helpful for us.
Has
Sure,
the
I'd be
city
happy to
attorney
do
looked
that.
at it yet? Or?
Not this section, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can flag it for the city attorney. As it happens, I'm actually scheduled to give a briefing to the DRB next week on a variety of things, including where you're at with this project. So if you like, I'd be happy to bring this to them and have them cogitate on it a little bit.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
I think that, an example of what this is meant to do is, for example, you've got lot width to depth ratios. It might be that because of the presence of a natural resource, that in order to logically lay something out, 3 of the lots need to be squatter than they are otherwise supposed to be. So it's really not supposed to be sort of wholesale things, but the point is taken, and we'll work on it.
Yeah, like I said, I think the language in general is pretty good. That where I have a problem is where you go, comma, or other legal or development constraints, because that to me is what allows the wiggle room. And maybe there's a way to change that half a sentence a little bit to tighten it up, or just take that out, one or the other. But I'm sure the lawyer and the DRB might have input into that as well.
I had one last thing on, it was just a question of language, Paul, on 18A, 15A, 18D, the language is a bit confusing. It says the city engineer may at their discretion, and then may again. It seems to me that the city engineer may at his discretion perform inspections needed during the installation.
Just one second. Let me pull that up so that I see what you're speaking about.
Under D, inspection and of improvements.
May perform inspections as needed during installation to verify the satisfactory completion of required work. So what's your? Oh, may and may.
It says
okay. Yep.
And the city engineer is singular, not plural.
Yeah, that's becoming an interesting language question. I think that how to be gender neutral is becoming an interesting grammarian. I think that that's probably what the consultant wrote as but we'll look at that.
One other language thing that's confusing is in 15A09B under minor subdivision amendment. The last sentence reads modification to an approved subdivision which do not result in elements of the plat. May be reviewed. I don't know what that means.
Oh, okay. I think what that meant to say is that if you're making changes that do not change things that are on the plat itself, so there are often supplemental things that are shown on a subdivision plat that don't materially change anything. It might be an easement call out or something like that. So it seems like that's an incomplete sentence. We'll correct that.
Okay, that's it for me.
And I have one other on 15A12C, resource identification. I guess I'm not clear on, it does say as specified in Articles 10 and 12, but I did want to remind that we had been talking about the habitat connectors or corridors as potentially being movable. And I'm just wondering if that, needs to be called out in some way here. If we're asking them to identify a resource at the time they're doing their plan, it would be awfully good for them to know that with their initial plan, they can propose to move, to shift or adjust the location of a corridor at the time that they're identifying it.
Okay, we'll make we can make a cross reference in there as to if Article 12 allows for any kind of modifications, that that should be identified at that same time.
Yes, thank you.
I was just working in Article 12 today to do that half of those cross connections, so we'll make sure that we've done it.
So I actually have a question. It's something on this page, line 22. It talks about conservation lots to be maintained and managed in single or common ownership, and then it goes on to some other options. Yep. And that's clear to me and makes a lot of sense. But what I didn't see similar clarity for the civic space lots. I know it's not in the section right here, but we do talk about the creation of a civic space lot in the section where we're talking about that 10%, and it wasn't clear who would own it.
Okay. We'll work on that. I think it should probably be mirroring this language, that it's either an association or the city. I think it'll be somewhat of a case by case as to whether the city wants one of those as a public park, or whether it makes sense to be a private one. But at least some language that mirrors this language would make sense. Is that what you were asking for, or were you thinking that the decision should be made about whether they're public?
I don't know that we need to make that decision. I just wanted to make sure it was addressed somewhere to give some options or some expectation, so that somebody has to make that decision at some point. So.
Okay.
I actually have, I guess, a question for the group. We've got some really great comments in the chat. I haven't read them all word for word. A lot of them kind of came up as we were discussing things, and I guess I just want to make sure that we're all reading what's in the chat, and or it's being recorded as part of the recording. Paul, do you know that if the chat items ever make it into the recording?
I can download them separately, and I'm happy to send them around or ask Sue to put them in the minutes or something like that.
Yeah, it feels like if they could make it into the minutes, it might be really helpful, because although someone didn't say them out loud, it was feedback that we're getting and kind of seeing as part of the meeting, if that's
sure
possible.
Sue,
yeah, it should definitely be in the minutes, and if there was a response, that should be in the minutes too.
Sure. Well, if it was spoken about, then it was probably covered in the minutes. If it's a comment that the commission hasn't had a chance to respond to,
that's fine for the comments that went to everybody. But I think
with yeah, no, just
no. What I meant was some of the chat comments were intended for a specific person, not for everyone.
No, I agree. You know, sometimes someone might send one just to me to say I'm on mute or something. Like, I don't think if it's something that went specifically to a specific person, that wasn't like a public comment, you know. If
those that went to everyone.
Yeah.
I think that once a call is done, once we disconnect a call, I think the chats disappear. So.
Right, I can download them, so I'll make sure that they get downloaded, and the ones that were sent to everyone, I'll get them over to Sue. Sue, is that okay with you?
Sounds good. Sounds good to me. And by the way, Paul, your use of the word "there" is now grammatically acceptable. I am an English teacher.
Very good. Thank you. Does it feel like we adequately discussed the subdivision language so that our next part of the conversation can be the master plan piece?
Yep.
Okay. It is 9:03, and we do have another meeting tomorrow, which the same item is on. Does it feel like people are ready to kind of just start the master plan language discussion fresh tomorrow? Okay.
I have very little on master plan. I bet if we gave it 10 minutes to just see if there's anything significant, but there's a couple of big things that if we spent 10 minutes.
Does that seem?
This is good for me.
To do a start now? We'll say we'll give it 15 minutes and then we'll be done for the night. And we'll pick back up tomorrow. Okay.
I like the idea of starting with the master plan tomorrow.
Okay, maybe what we can do is do the other things on our agenda now and then have, because I know it is sometimes hard to pick up in the middle of a conversation. So maybe we can do a short discussion about the presentation to the city council. So we maybe have that in our heads for tomorrow. I have not planned anything yet. I know that it is next Monday night, and I do plan to attend and can represent us in some capacity. So I guess if anyone has input on what they think we should talk about, or Paul, I know we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, but if anyone had any general suggestions, or Paul, if you have an idea, maybe we could be thinking about it.
Yeah, I guess my big question for you all is, you've done a lot of work in the last couple months. Happy to help you to synthesize that for a presentation. Is there anything that you wanted to highlight that you wanted to sort of get a briefing on tomorrow night as to the status of things that would give you the opportunity to then talk about it with council? I'm assuming that you would like to have, at least a status as to where the PUD language is, how far along we are with TDRs, and the various different moving pieces. But if there was anything that you wanted me to be thinking about tomorrow to bring to you, that's kind of what I was putting on the agenda tonight. Things that you're sort of, that you'd like to have had the chance to get a status update on before your presentation.
Oh, can I ask a quick question? This language we just saw, we're going to see similar language when the PUD piece is totally finished?
It's going to be the PUDs will be much shorter because they build off this.
Okay.
But yes, so this will exist for subdivisions, and then PUDs will be the PUD specific stuff and where it modifies this.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I just was going to say, in terms of the city council meeting, it would be amazing if you could show them some of the maps, which I think we're going to look at tomorrow. But if we can give them a sample citywide of like the habitat block and the extensions, I think that would be very, very helpful.
Okay. I just got today the properly done work that you went through at your last meeting. The Regional Planning Commission helped us to map it instead of just my hand drawing. I have not verified it, so there may be a couple of things that aren't exactly 100% yet, but so we'll be in a position to at least share it with you tomorrow.
Great. I think along the lines of what Monica was saying is being able to share the mapping tool that we've been using so much, at least as a very general overview, to make sure that they've seen it and understand that we have that information. Seems like a good thing to include. And the scheduling items, like you said.
Okay, good.
Okay, then we have some minutes. Yeah, do.
Move to approve the minutes of September the 9th and September the 29th.
Second.
Okay, do we have any discussion about the minutes? Okay, all in favor of approval of the minutes? All right.
Aye.
Aye.
I saw everyone's hand and or heard everyone's. That was unanimous. Thank you very much. And I guess we'll see everybody tomorrow at 7.
Thanks, everyone. I really
So
appreciate the extra
tomorrow,
7 tomorrow.
tomorrow we will pick up on this section that we were just about to start on
Yes.
the master plan.
And I think it makes sense to do a similar thing to what we did tonight, the bullet points in the staff memo and discuss anything in there, and then follow up with specifics on the language kind of as a second piece.
Sounds
And
good.
I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about Article 12 tomorrow night as well, and just sort of update you on where things are. I can't remember if the whole commission has talked about it, or if I've just spoken to Jessica about some ideas around the 500-year floodplain that you asked about. So I wanted to button that back up. So those were a couple things that I was hoping to at least give you a status update on.
Cool.
Great.
All right.
Well,
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Will that involve incorporating the regulatory aspects of the 100-year floodplain with the 500-year, sort of combining them in a way?
We have some ideas for that I wanted to share with you tomorrow night. Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, a quick question. Did we resolve or come to an agreement on our buildable level for
We did.
resources? We did
No,
not. So we'll do that tomorrow?
We kind of left that hanging.
Okay. Is that part of tomorrow's? Are we going to try to come to a decision tomorrow on that?
I guess so.
You mean Monica, are you talking about the calculation of buildable area and what to exclude?
Leaving level 2 out or in.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we didn't get there.
But I guess we weren't decided, so we'll have to pick back up. So.
Okay.
Good
Thanks,
night,
everyone.
everybody.
See you tomorrow.
Good night.